The House That Watched. In 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. shot and killed 6 members of his family inside their home at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, Long Island, New York. It was a sleepy suburb, quiet streets, white picket fences, children playing in yards, neighbors greeting each other over mailboxes. The kind of place where people felt safe and where life rolled on without much fear. But on November 13th of that year, at around 3 a.m., everything changed forever inside that large Dutch colonial house with the tall quarter-moon windows that looked like a pair of eyes watching the street. The house had stood there for years, purchased by the DeFeo family in 1965, lived in and loved, until one night it became the scene of a real-life nightmare that would echo through every horror story that came after. On that terrible night, 23-year-old Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. walked quietly through his hallways while everyone in the house slept. He carried a .35 caliber lever-action rifle. His parents, Ronald DeFeo Sr. and Louise DeFeo, were in the master bedroom. His siblings Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John Matthew were tucked into their own rooms, dreaming, unaware of what was coming. The rifle's shot echoed only in the house's dark corridors, leaving an unexplainable silence outside. No neighbors reported hearing the crash of gunfire, no heart-stopping screams. When police later found the bodies of the DeFeo family, all 6 were face down in their beds, shot while asleep. There were no signs of struggle, no frantic attempts at escape, only death, quiet and total. Hours later, Butch DeFeo walked into Henry's Bar, a local dive not far from the house, eyes wide and wild like someone who had seen things no human should ever see. "You've got to help me," he cried. "I think my mother and father are shot." A few patrons followed him back to the house, a simple block back down Ocean Avenue, and that was when they saw it. The grand facade of 112 Ocean Avenue standing stoic in the morning light, not yet scarred by its terrible past, but hiding it within. Inside, the silence was worse than any sound. 6 bodies, lifeless and still, lay in beds that only hours earlier had held laughter, late-night whispers, midnight bathroom trips, the normal rhythms of life. The victims were Ronald DeFeo Sr., 43, father and provider; Louise DeFeo, 43, mother and heart of the home; Dawn, 18, eldest daughter; Allison, 13, dreamy and sweet; Mark, 12, boyish and energetic; John Matthew, 9, youngest and smiling even in death. All were killed with devastating precision. Butch DeFeo later confessed to police that he had carried out the murders and then attempted to blame organized crime, mob hitmen, anything but the truth that he himself had methodically taken every life he had known. The sheriff's deputies, the crime lab technicians, the reporters who gathered that morning, no one could shake the feeling that the house itself seemed to watch them. Its tall windows stared like unblinking eyes. Its silent rooms seemed to swallow sound and hunger for fear. And though the killings themselves sent shockwaves through the region, it was what happened next that would transform the Amityville house from a grim crime scene into one of America's most infamous horror legends. A year passed. The house stood empty for a while, its reputation already beginning to grow darker than the shadows that gathered in its corners at night. Then, in December 1975, a new family arrived, the Lutzes, George and Kathy Lutz, and Kathy's 3 children from a previous marriage. They thought they were buying a dream home, a large house at a reduced price because the owners were desperate to sell. They saw it not as a crime scene, but as a chance at a fresh start, unaware of the horror hidden in its walls. The moment they stepped inside, something in the air shifted, like a heavy sigh released from the rafters, a cold pulse not felt in the winter air outside but deep within the house's bones. The temperature dropped inexplicably, even with the heat running, and from that moment on, the Lutz family would tell a story that would blur the lines between human tragedy and supernatural dread. A story so terrifying that they fled the house after only 28 days, and their testimony would change the house forever. Some say nothing supernatural ever happened, that the Lutzes made it up. Others swear the house itself is evil. Skeptics call it a hoax, but horror stories rarely die just because someone doubts them. The Amityville house was changed to discourage tourists, its eerie quarter-moon windows removed, its address altered, but the legend remains, its roots stained with the blood of a family and the fear of countless others. The house was still awake. George and Kathy Lutz moved into 112 Ocean Avenue believing that time could wash away tragedy, the way rain washes blood from concrete, believing that new laughter could overwrite old screams, believing that a house was just wood and nails, and not something that could remember. But from the very first night, the house felt less like a home and more like a place that had been waiting, like something deep inside its walls had been listening for footsteps to return, and was now finally awake again. The first thing George noticed was the cold, not the kind that comes from winter or bad insulation, but the kind that crawls under your skin even when the heater is running, the kind that makes you feel like someone just walked past you in a dark room, and no matter how much he turned the thermostat up, the master bedroom stayed icy, the same room where Ronald DeFeo Sr. and Louise had been shot in their beds, the same room where two people had gone to sleep and never woken up. At night, strange sounds drifted through the house, low thuds like something heavy being dropped upstairs, whispers that faded when you tried to focus on them, the slow creak of floorboards even when no one was moving, and Kathy began to wake up at exactly 3:15 a.m. every single night, the same time when the DeFeo murders were believed to have taken place, her eyes snapping open as if something unseen had touched her heart pounding with a fear she could never quite explain. The children began to change too, becoming quiet, withdrawn, staring into corners and hallways as if something was standing there just out of sight, and the family dog refused to go near the basement, growling and pulling away whenever George tried to take it downstairs, its fur standing on end like it could sense something rotting beneath the floor. The basement was the worst. It was where DeFeo had kept his guns. It was where George felt the strongest presence, a heavy pressure in the air that made his chest feel tight, a smell that came and went, something like decay mixed with cold, damp earth. And when he stood there alone, he felt watched, not by eyes, but by the house itself, as if the walls were leaning inward to listen to his thoughts. And then the vision started. Kathy saw a little girl standing at the top of the stairs, pale and silent, her eyes empty and dark, watching them with a sad, knowing stare. And when Kathy blinked, the girl was gone, leaving behind nothing but a feeling of deep sorrow that lingered in the air like a ghost of emotion. George, who had never been a violent man, began to feel angry all the time, snapping at his family, waking up in cold sweats from dreams where something was chasing him through endless hallways, something with no face and too many teeth, something that lived inside the house and wanted him to become like it. And slowly, without even realizing it, he began to look more and more like Ronald DeFeo Jr., growing out his beard, wearing similar clothes, standing in the same places, as if the house was trying to mold him into a replacement. Every day felt heavier than the last. Doors slammed on their own. Objects moved when no one was looking. A black, oily substance oozed from the walls in one room, dripping slowly like the house itself was bleeding, and no matter how much they cleaned, it always came back dark and sticky, like a wound that refused to heal. One night, George heard voices coming from the basement, low and murmuring, too many to count, speaking words he couldn't understand. And when he opened the door, a wave of freezing air rushed past him, carrying with it a smell so foul it made him gag. And for a brief, terrifying second, he thought he saw something move in the darkness, something tall and twisted that vanished the moment the light touched it. The house was not empty. It never had been. And whatever lived there was slowly, patiently, tightening its grip on the family, feeding on their fear, their exhaustion, their love for one another, until the walls of 112 Ocean Avenue felt less like shelter and more like the inside of a living, breathing monster. The house was feeding. As the days passed inside 112 Ocean Avenue, the air grew heavier, like the walls themselves were closing in, and the Lutz family slowly realized that the house was not simply haunted, but alive in some terrible, unseen way, as if every tragedy that had ever happened there had soaked into the wood and plaster, and now whispered through the halls like 1,000 quiet voices, all speaking at once. George began waking in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, his heart racing, his ears filled with the sound of distant gunshots that were not really there. And every time he tried to go back to sleep, he saw flashes of a young man standing in the hallway, eyes hollow and dark, holding a rifle, staring at him like a reflection that didn't quite match. And slowly George started to feel like his thoughts weren't entirely his own anymore, like something else was pushing them, guiding them, pulling him deeper into the darkness of the house. Kathy tried to keep the family together, but even she felt the change, felt the way the house seemed to watch her, felt the way cold fingers brushed against her skin when no one was there. And sometimes, when she walked past the basement door, she swore she could hear a voice whispering her name from behind it, calling her softly, patiently, like a lover waiting in the dark. The children became more withdrawn, spending hours staring out of the windows, watching the slow movement of the canal behind the house, watching the way the water reflected the house's tall windows, making them look like glowing eyes staring back at them. And sometimes they said they could hear children laughing in the walls, quiet giggles echoing through the floors, even though no one else was home. One night, Kathy woke up to find George standing beside the bed, staring down at her, his face blank, his eyes cold and distant. And when she asked him what was wrong, he didn't answer. He just kept staring, as if he was no longer seeing her but something behind her, something that lived in the room with them, something that had been there long before they arrived. Then there was the room, the one the kids refused to enter. They said it was too cold, too dark, too wrong. And when Kathy finally went inside, she felt it immediately, a crushing weight in the air, like being underwater. And she saw scratch marks on the walls, deep gouges in the plaster as if something had been clawing its way out or in. And she knew with a certainty that made her stomach twist that this was where something terrible had happened long before the DeFeo murders, long before the house had ever been a home. George started spending more and more time in the basement, sitting in the cold, staring into the shadows, listening to voices only he could hear. And Kathy watched as the man she loved slowly became someone else, someone darker, angrier, someone who belonged to the house more than to his family. And she began to fear that if they stayed much longer, 112 Ocean Avenue would claim them the same way it had claimed the DeFeos. The house didn't want them to leave. It wanted them to become part of it. Something was walking the hallways. By the second week inside the house, none of them felt like they were really sleeping anymore, only drifting in and out of something thin and fragile, because every night the same feeling returned, that someone was standing just outside their bedroom doors, listening, breathing, waiting. And even when the halls were empty, the air felt disturbed, as if something invisible had just passed through. George began waking every morning at 3:15 a.m. without an alarm, without a sound, his eyes snapping open like he had been called, and he would lie there staring at the ceiling, heart pounding, listening to whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. And no matter how hard he tried to ignore them, the voices grew clearer, darker, repeating words he didn't understand but somehow felt in his bones. Kathy noticed the way George's eyes had changed, how they looked colder, distant, as if the man she married was slowly being pushed aside to make room for something else. And sometimes when he spoke, his voice sounded hollow, almost echoing, as though it had passed through another mouth before leaving his. The children were no better. They complained about cold hands touching them at night, about something sitting on their beds when they tried to sleep, about a presence in their closets and behind their doors. And one morning Kathy found strange marks on one of the walls, shapes that looked like hooves burned into the paint, black and deep, impossible to explain, impossible to erase. The house was changing too. Doors would be found open when they had been locked. Windows would fog from the inside, forming shapes that looked like faces pressed against the glass. The smell of decay would drift through the halls, thick and sweet and rotten, appearing suddenly and then vanishing as if the house itself was breathing. One night, Kathy woke to the sound of someone walking through the living room, slow, deliberate footsteps packing back and forth, and when she went to look, she found no one there, only the soft impression of footprints in the carpet, as if something heavy had passed through but left no body behind. George, meanwhile, had started talking to himself. Or at least that was what Kathy thought. But when she listened more closely, she realized he wasn't talking to himself at all. He was answering someone who wasn't there. And every time he spoke, his tone was different, colder, angrier, like he was slowly becoming something the house wanted him to be, something that belonged to the darkness hidden in its walls. The house was no longer just watching them. It was shaping them. The basement was calling. The basement became George's favorite place, though he never said why, and every time Kathy watched him walk down those steps into the darkness, she felt a knot twist in her stomach, because something about that space felt wrong in a way that went beyond fear, like it was not just a room but a wound in the house, a place where something terrible had bled into the walls and never left. Down there, the air was colder than anywhere else in the house, thick and heavy, and sometimes when George stood alone in the shadows, he could hear faint murmuring, voices overlapping, whispering his name, telling him he was chosen, telling him he belonged, and little by little he began to believe them, because the house was patient and it knew how to wear people down. Kathy started to notice the way George stared at the children, not with love, but with something distant and empty, like he was seeing something else when he looked at them, something from another time, another family, and that terrified her more than any strange sound or moving object ever could. One afternoon, she found him standing in one of the bedrooms, holding a rifle he had taken down from the wall, his face pale and emotionless. And for a horrible second, she saw a reflection in his eyes that wasn't his own, a dark shape, tall and twisted, standing behind him like a shadow that didn't belong to the light. The house was replaying something, rehearsing it, reliving the night when blood had soaked into its floors. Kathy began to feel that the walls themselves were whispering, reminding the house of what it had once been, what it wanted to be again, and every night she prayed that they would make it through until morning without something terrible happening. The children started having nightmares of gunshots and screams, waking up crying, saying they saw a man in their dreams who looked like George but wasn't him, a man with dead eyes who stood in the doorway of their rooms and watched them sleep. And Kathy realized that whatever had taken Ronald DeFeo Jr. was now reaching for her husband. The house was not done with killing. It was just waiting for the right moment, the night everything almost ended. By the third week, the house no longer bothered to hide what it was doing, and strange things began to happen in the open, in full view, as if whatever lived there knew it had already wrapped itself around the family and was no longer afraid of being seen. One night, the children woke up screaming because their beds were shaking, not violently, but with a slow, rhythmic movement, like something heavy was walking underneath them. And when Kathy ran into their room, she saw the crucifix on the wall turned upside down, blackened as if burned, and a smell like sulfur filled the air so thick it made her eyes water. George came running, but instead of being afraid, he just stood there staring, his lips moving silently, as if he were listening to something none of them could hear. And when Kathy tried to pull him away, he resisted, his strength suddenly far greater than it should have been. And in that moment, she realized that the house had already taken part of him. Later that night, Kathy woke up to find George gone from bed. She followed the sound of slow footsteps down the hallway, her heart pounding, and when she reached the basement door, she saw a faint red glow seeping out from underneath it, pulsing like a heartbeat. When she opened it, she found George standing in the darkness, staring into nothing, whispering words in a low, guttural voice that did not sound like his own. And when he turned to look at her, his eyes were black, reflecting no light at all. He smiled, and for a terrifying second, Kathy saw not her husband, but something else wearing his face, something ancient and cruel that had been waiting inside the house for new flesh to inhabit. The house was no longer just haunted. It was possessed. By the 28th night, there was no doubt left inside the Lutz family that the house did not want them alive. Only inside it, only broken, only changed into something that belonged to its walls and shadows. And George was no longer really George anymore, because whatever had been whispering to him in the basement had finally crawled all the way into his thoughts, into his memories, into the part of him that made him human. And what remained was something cold and obedient to the will of the house. Kathy woke in the darkness to the sound of him moving through the hallway, slow and steady, like a man who knew exactly where he was going. And when she opened her eyes, she saw him standing in the doorway of the bedroom, holding the rifle, his face blank and calm in a way that made her blood run cold, because she knew in that moment that the house was trying to make him repeat what had happened before, trying to turn him into another Ronald DeFeo, trying to feed on the same blood again. The children were asleep down the hall, unaware of how close they were to being swallowed by the same nightmare. And Kathy knew there was no more time left to hope, no more time left to pray, because the house had already decided what it wanted. She begged George to stop, but he didn't hear her, his eyes focused on something behind her, something only he could see. And when he lifted the rifle, she saw a flicker of hesitation pass through him, a tiny spark of the man he used to be, fighting against the darkness that had taken over his mind. That was when the house reacted. The walls began to shake, the temperature dropped so fast that their breath turned to frost, and from every corner of the room came a low, hateful whisper, thousands of voices layered together, pushing George forward, urging him to finish what had been started in this house years before. And Kathy realized with a sick certainty that this place was not haunted by one spirit, but by the memory of murder itself, by the echo of every scream and every gunshot that had ever stained its floors. With a strength born of terror, Kathy screamed for the children to run, and in that single moment of chaos, something inside George broke free from the house's grip, just long enough for him to drop the rifle, his hands shaking, his face twisting in pain as if he were fighting an invisible force inside his own body. They didn't wait. Kathy grabbed the kids and ran through the house, past doors that slammed shut on their own, past walls that seemed to lean inward, past windows that showed not the outside world but twisted reflections of the house itself, until they burst through the front door and into the freezing night, leaving behind everything they owned, everything they had been, because all that mattered was getting away from that place before it could take them too. They drove through the darkness with the house shrinking behind them, but even as it disappeared from view, Kathy could still feel it watching, still feel the weight of its presence clinging to them like a shadow that refused to fade. And long after they were gone, 112 Ocean Avenue stood silent again, waiting, its windows dark, its walls soaked with the memory of blood and fear. Some say nothing supernatural ever happened there, that it was all just a story, a hoax, a lie, but houses remember, and some memories never die. And even now, when the night is quiet and the street is empty, there are those who swear they can see something moving behind those windows, something patient and hungry, still waiting for the next family to believe that a house is just a house. Because in Amityville, the horror never really ended.